All right, troops, welcome. It's February 23rd, and we'll march on. We've got a good session today, some important content actually, and this is it's going to be a part two to our focus on running and form of running into the new concept of MFP, which is really, it's not a new concept, it's a new naming and a new with in Hawaii today a little bit, and try and join the dots between the elements of running form that we went through in part one on Monday, and now join it into the real world, which is the most important thing. How do we actually apply this to training and ultimately racing? So that's going to be the majority of our discussion today. Just before we dive into it, I think that we do have to tip our hats a little bit to the professional squad so far, what they've done this year. We've had 4 races. Tim won the Australian Long Course Championship, so a win there. Sam Appleton last weekend, a win at Geelong, a fantastic performance coming off camp. Jesse started his year with a little bit of a points grab with a 5th place in Chile. And then last weekend, Laura Siddall missing the overall win by 27 seconds at Challenge Wanaka. But you come that close and you can think that you can be disappointed, but she comes out of it with great confidence and real satisfaction. We would have loved to have won the race, but Yvonne, who did win the race, was a worthy champion as well. And it was 2 great athletes producing 2 world-class performances. You say that with intent, world-class performances, and a wonderful battle that we came out on the other side of. But a great race from Laura, great race last weekend from Sam Appleton. So congratulations to those guys. They're off to a good start. But today, we're going to talk about running. We're going to talk about MFP. So we've got trusty sidekick Paul with me. We'll go back and forth, and we'll launch into it. So let's start, and let's remind everyone that if you haven't watched or viewed Monday's session around the elements of running form, it's really worth watching that. Almost stop watching this now, go back, watch the elements of running form, and then come back and continue, because that provides the context for this. As a reminder, for an educational and awareness cue, we talk about MFP, minimum form pace. And so that we can define what that is, that's effectively the slowest pace that you can retain while all of those elements, the basic elements, the fundamental elements of good form, are present. And that is just for memory: posture, lean, good arm carriage with the arm propulsion, the active components of the arm carriage occurring behind the body, and then those 2 final elements of leg propulsion or leg drive, finishing through the big toe, really getting some horizontal propulsive elements and leg speed. So those are the 5 elements. When all of those are present, you will be running at a certain pace. And if you want to run slower than that, you are going to have to remove some of those elements. And normally the 2 elements that you would, with intent, remove would be some leg speed and certainly some leg propulsion, some leg drive. You would take some of that out, but you would want to retain good posture, good arm carriage, good arm lean, etc., etc. So that's the awareness. These are the join the dots that we want to try and go through today. Let's take an example, because on Monday we showed you Sarah Piampiano and Jessie Thomas and their run form, great running form, great principles of running form, to try and highlight the elements that we're looking for ultimately. Well, if I ask Jessie Thomas to run at MFP, it's no problem. Jessie can run with good form, with all of the elements present, at a very sustainable effort. And we have to put that into context, because if Jessie's half Ironman pace, race pace, is give or take around 5:15 minute mile pace, that's what he's looking to do, 5:10 or 5:15 per mile for his half Ironman pace. But the slowest pace that Jessie can run at, while retaining all of those 5 elements of good running form, is give or take 7:15, 7:30 pace, somewhere in there. And so that's not a problem for him. It's 2 minutes per mile slower than what he's hoping to do over the course of 13 miles. So Jesse could hold that pace for a long time and be conversational. And the reason he can do that is he's really fit. He's got a huge running background. He's got great strength, and his body weight relative to the size of his engine, his cardiovascular capacity, is a little bit like a race car. He has a big engine with a frame and the strength to carry it, and he's really fit. Not all amateurs have that, Paul. In fact, most amateurs don't have the ability to retain MFP while over an extended period managing heart rate and breathing. So in other words, a good percentage, I wouldn't say most amateurs, but a good percentage of our athletes, perhaps 30% or so of our athletes, cannot run with all of the elements of good form, MFP, without going under heart rate distress. Why don't you discuss that a little bit?
In some ways, it's a target for a lot of our athletes, is to get to a place where they can run consistently with the minimum number of breaks at that minimum form pace. And it's, I mean, the idea kind of, or bringing the idea into the public forum kind of came about because we had a lot of athletes who struggled with zones in running. It's like I can't run at zone 2. And the reality is that they couldn't run properly at zone 2 because they didn't have all those elements that Matt just talked about, you know, the appropriate balance of fitness, resilience, you know, mass, etc. So there's, you know, the most important thing with the running is running well as consistently as possible in these long events. And that's where it's always been a good idea to reset running form with a walk break and then run well. And that running well is what this MFP is all about. So it's as Matt said, it's not a new idea, it's just clear thinking on an old idea, and it's a way of understanding the intent of the training a little bit more, because our primary goal is that we want to do as much of our running as possible with good form, or consciously subtract elements of form so as we're not practicing poor running.
It's super, and that's it. And the ultimate goal for many athletes is to extend the amount of time that they can spend at MFP, so running with good form, basically, in both training and in events. And what you should see as fitness improves, as your technical components improve, which starts with awareness, it starts with this, is that it's not for your MFP to get slower or faster. Your minimum form pace is going to be probably about the same, but the associated cost should go down. So how do we conquer this in training and racing? Let's go through it. So we talked about Jesse being able to pee for a long time, 7 to 7:15 pace. But if I want Jesse to go on an easy run, where the sole purpose of an easy run is to build some muscular resilience and or actually flush the system a little bit, so it could even be for certain athletes a little bit of recovery. I don't want Jesse to be running under the associated physical demands of what MFP would dictate. I want him to go even slower than that. So even for Jesse, when he's either warming up or when he's going on a very easy run, he won't have too much MFP per se in there. But what he will do is he will consciously, with awareness, with intent, extract elements of the form, of all of the elements of good form. So in Jesse's case, on an easy run, he will retain good posture, making sure his arm carriage is good. It will still look pretty, but he'll remove some of the propulsive elements, and therefore he can really keep, firstly the pace will drop, but also the associated stress will drop down. One of the things that we noticed, and this is I think one of the things that the pros are really guilty of, it's an easy run and the brain switches off. But there are all sorts of things that you can do on an easy run with intent, even for a higher end runner. So let's talk about a higher end runner first, who can hold MFP for a long time. If you're going on an easy run, that's not licensed to turn off, Paul. There are lots of things that you can do to retain purpose, to keep the dialogue of the brain talking to the muscles first. So why don't we go through some of those on an easy run? Walking breaks in there to help propulsion, the use of a park bench, powering over some of the hills to get the brain talking. There are lots of things you can do on an easy run that still get to improving the basic elements of good form, eh?
Oh, for sure. And it's only possible to consciously subtract elements of good running form if you know what they are and you have a connection between brain and body to be able to add them, subtract them, check in on them, improve the efficiency of them. So on those form type runs where the pace is easy and the overall output is relatively low, it's the perfect time to do that. And you get to, not only do you get to subtract elements of good form, but you get to practice what they are. And that striding, powerful walk where you get to, in effectively slow motion without the acceleration of the mass above the ground, because both feet aren't off the ground at the same time, you get to practice the connection between the arm drive and what happens at the rear of the stride. So in slow motion, effectively, you get to practice that posterior activation. You can practice it on a rise. So as the incline gets greater, you can understand the difference in how the foot placement is relative to the ground, and that as the slope gets steeper, the place that the foot strikes the ground moves further forward. You can, on the downhills, you can practice the short strides, but really, really fast turnover. So you get to lean forward, move the arms really quickly until the legs lose coordination effectively, but you're not running fast. You're just turning your legs over fast. Pull the pace out, reset, practice, and that over time, much in the same way as over cadence work on the bicycle, will gradually increase the rate that you're comfortable running at as far as turnover goes. Things that you don't get to eliminate is you don't get to practice leaning back or slumping when you're in any of these things. So one thing that stays constant all the way when you're subtracting elements of good form is that you stand tall with good posture throughout any of these elements. Because one of the most common mistakes is when people people subtract pace from their run, they do it by leaning back.
Yeah. And
that's just practicing a bad habit.
Exactly. Now, tangentially, part 3 to this will be captured this weekend. I'm going to head out, and some of the things we're talking about, running fast downhill, getting to power over some rises with some propulsion, some of the power walking or striding, as we're mentioning here, utilizing some steps or park benches to get the brain talking to the leg drive, getting it to activate the glutes and the posterior activation. I'm going to go and capture all of this on film this weekend and put it out for you guys so that you can see it and give you some context of this. So we'll patiently await that. But conceptually, you have to realize that there's a tremendous amount of stuff that you can do within an easy run, within a recovery run, that helps you understand that connection between brain and body, so that you, when we progress into endurance running and above, you have a better opportunity to get there. So we'll dovetail to the endurance run a little bit. And there's a fundamental truth that happens no matter the level that you are for running. So we started with the athletes challenge. Many of our athletes, a strong percentage of our athletes, cannot run with all elements of good form without their heart rate going through the roof. But the challenge is that in order to improve, in order to us to get to a place that we can run sustainably with good form, because running well is a key ingredient to race performance, we have to spend time at MFP. We have to spend blocks of time running with good form. There's no point in only running easy or saying I've got to keep my heart rate down and never running in full flight with good form. all you're going to do is become very, very efficient at running with 2/3 of good elements of good form and never get to train the form base. So we have to, even in an endurance run, we have to try and spend ever increasing blocks of time with all of the elements of good running form there, without losing the personality and the intent of the session. So how in the world do we do that? Well, we have to adopt a pragmatic lens. We have to say, okay, how am I going to manage my way through that? And depending on the level of athlete, the higher tier athlete that so far as running, they might be oscillating between easier running, extracting propulsion, extracting some of the leg speed, and ever increasing blocks of time at MFP with leg propulsion. So when it's creeping up a little bit, they can manage and they can use the management tool of conscious extraction of elements to help them navigate their way through an endurance run. Other athletes, on the meantime, they might not have the reality of running an entire endurance run. And this is even before we think about terrain. So they will have 3 management tools. They will have running with good form, MFP, which will be tough to sustain. They'll have some running without all of the elements there, so some conscious extraction. And then they'll have purposeful walking. And those 3 elements need to be trained, because the reality for many of our athletes is those 3 elements are going to have a role to play in your racing. They're going to have a role to play in your racing. The vast majority of athletes, and it is a majority, will not run an entire Ironman. They will be purposefully adopting walking to reset good running form and to enable the running that they are going to do in their racing to be effective, to be great. And so we want to think about integration of these 3 elements, MFP, but with a little bit of removal. Let's call it MFP minus, just for sake of it. And then walking with purpose. And walking with purpose, that drives posterior activation. That drives the arms driving behind us. So we want to do that in the course of our runs. Well, let's first now layer on terrain on top of that. So Paul, walk breaks, there's lots of methodologies out there between walk breaks in running, and they all are very formulaic. Run 4, walk 1, run 4, walk 1, 110, walk 1, whatever it might be. And I think that's an incorrect way of going about it, because of the penalties or the lack of penalties relative to terrain, uphill and downhill. So why don't you talk about terrain management first, and then we can sort of drive into maybe some real world examples of how you would use walking, MFP walking, and getting out of that. So let's talk about terrain first.
Well, it's where the run and the bike and the swim, for that matter, have some parallels. You know, on the bike you've got a lot of tools to manage your output. Running, a smaller number of tools, but they are there, and different types of running form to manage the terrain. Now, for a lot of people, the benefit of running at MFP, or if you're not able to run consistently at MFP of slightly less than that, of running uphill like that, has a cost that far outweighs the benefit. So what we've got to be aware of, instead of going, let's run 3 minutes, walk 1 minute, or vice versa, is what's the best return on investment for using this walk to manage the terrain and our physical resource. And this is something we talk about all the time on the bike. You're constantly thinking, what's the best tool for the job to manage the physical condition that you're in and the terrain that's in front of you. So, and you'll choose a different tool often, depending on where you are and the balance of those things. So many of our athletes, the most effective way to manage the physical stress is to run as close to MFP, or if you're a better runner, MFP plus that little bit of race effort, or if you're a not so good runner, managing that running MFP as much as possible and subtracting an element of good form, But then the common sense thing to do is it drives the cost up a lot trying to run uphill. So what's a better tool for the job? I'm going to use that strong striding walk to manage the hills. I'm going to get up the hill at probably as fast, if not faster, than what turns quickly into a shuffling run with bad form at a lower heart rate. And then I can use that to manage the overall stress of the event by making good pace with the right tool for the job. And then on the downhills, it's like gravity's on my side. I'm going to run with that good turnover that I've had. And sure, I may not have the ability to run with good turnover and propel myself well off the ground and increase the distance that I travel. But if I run downhill with really good leg turnover, gravity is going to assist me getting there. And having practiced that, I'll have the resilience for doing it without beating the legs up too much. And then balance those things as the event goes. Then what happens is you get really, really good at picking up the subtle differences in terrain. Is it slightly uphill to that next lamppost? Is my heart rate starting to get up a little bit? I'm going to walk to that next lamppost with my purposeful striding walk, bring the heart rate back down, and then do my best approximation of MFP or MFP minus one element of good form. And by joining the dots, by managing the physical resource and understanding not only the obvious, but the subtle changes of the course, all of a sudden you get from A to B using the best tool for the job as often as you can and the lowest physical stress. I mean, we are racing, so it doesn't mean that it's going to be a holiday, but you're at that place where you're never blowing up, but going as quickly as you can using the limited tools that we have when you're running. We don't have gears, we don't have the ability to freewheel, but we do have options.
And you know, it's funny, it requires this magical thing, which is to be present of where you're at. It requires thinking. And so if the tool that people bring is just toughness, and they're just working hard and they're not, or they're thinking about outcomes. This is why, just drawing the dot, this is why we talk about process so much as well, and not be chasing or being overly competitive, because so many of events is doing what you can do. You have to be in the moment. You have to be thinking. You have to be planning. And as you say, it's no different than the awareness that's required in open water, and certainly the awareness around terrain management on the bike. So it's exactly the same thing. And while we don't have the same tools, it's exactly it, because the goal is still the same. We want to get from A to B as fast as we can. And it is better to integrate walking so that the more of the running that you do is done with great form, or at least your best impersonation of great form. So this is the difference between training effectively and then racing effectively and simply survival. It's really thinking through. But the ultimate thing is, if you don't think through this in your training, you don't actually remain present, practice this in training, it's not going to happen in a race. You can't suddenly get there and start pulling tools out of the box that are shiny and still in their packages, they've never been used. You have to actually really think through this. So 2 examples that just quickly I'll give. The first is the more advanced runner. You've got managing rolling terrain. With that more advanced runner, they might be at MFP or above. They might be running, you know, with that little race intensity. So in their endurance run, they're doing most of their time at MFP on their endurance training run. In a race, they're above MFP, but certainly all the elements are there if they're at a higher speed than their MFP. And they might need to, based on terrain, extract an element or two if they're coming up to a hill, or if they're just feeling like the cost is getting a little high, they might just extract a little bit of propulsion, shift the gears a little bit to sort of use the metaphor, and then come back into it. And the only time they might walk is in the very, very steep grades. Great example is Jesse Thomas at Wildflower, where there's a couple of very steep hills that he walks up, because the speed penalty is so minimal that he knew that if he just walks up 100 yards, the running that he does that he is going to do between there and the next steep hill is much better running form. versus exploding on the heart rate to get over a 100-yard hill that's extremely steep, and then having to recover with poor form that's running much slower for the next 500 yards. It's not the best return on his investment. So for the advanced runner, you've got MFP or plus, a bit of MFP minus when they need to manage terrain or lower the cost to manage out of it, and then super steep stuff they walk. For a lower end athlete on the running component, they might have elements of MFP until the heart rate starts to creep and they start to feel the cost coming up. And even on a flat terrain, they might need to then come into 15 seconds or so of walking and then develop into purposeful striding, bring the heart rate back down, resettle. The purposeful walking gets the brain talking to the muscle with leg drive. You start to reburn that pathway, then they build back into running again and build back then into running close to or at all of the elements of for good form doing that. And you use running both maybe even a flat course and certainly over a rolling terrain to that good effect. So the last thing I'll say on it is that you have to bring in your race ultimately, firstly, your racing should be an expression of your training. But I always find it amusing when I hear athletes, and I hear athletes getting this advice: you can just never walk. The whole thing about Ironman is staying consistent and just refusing to walk. Well, that's really tough, but there's no award for running a whole Ironman. And that approach, that mindset is stupid if it means that you've never walked, but you did the vast majority of the race with really poor running form that was slow. It's much better to manage the terrain, strategically walk, and then run the running bits with great form and end up faster. Because certainly that mindset with every level of athlete, once you develop that awareness, that mindset will be the biggest yield. And it's a hard concept because it's like, well, they're running the whole time. Yeah, but they're running with incredibly bad declining form. And they're just running stooped with ever reducing elements of good form in there. Versus if we can use it strategically and in practice, the naysayers, almost every time, the naysayers that can't get their head around it, and when they're sent out to go and do it in practice, the feedback is always the same. Wow, I included walk breaks, and on my little hour loop, with the walking included, I still went faster. And the reason for it is that we're preventing the decline of resources, preventing the decline of form, and the running that you are doing, which for many athletes will be the vast majority of the run session, will be done with good form, and therefore you're making best propulsion. Because if you have leg drive, each one of your strides should be this much longer. And if each one of your strides is this much longer or this much longer or this much longer, but that accumulates if you're doing 180 steps or 175 steps per minute over the course of many miles. That's why you go faster. So I think we have to recircle around and say, look, you're not Jesse Thomas, you're not Sarah Piampiano, few people are. So adopt a pragmatic mindset, train for yourself, and practice it. So I hope that helps join the dots conceptually of an easy run, an endurance run, and then above that into some racing. The final piece of this little episode on running, as I say, we're going to go capture some video this weekend. We'll have that out hopefully next week. And you can see some of the exercises and some of the things, and I'll have some of the pros this weekend do some downhill running, some uphill running, and you'll be able to see some good and probably with those guys some bad that we're doing. Paul, anything to add in closing before we go to questions?
Just emphasising what you know. I just had a chap commenting at Challenge Wanaka this weekend about, don't, dip into the cookie jar of walking because, once you've got the lid off, you won't be able to stop getting your hand in there sort of thing. And, it's the worst sin you can commit and so on. But for the vast majority of athletes that were at that race, it was the common sense and smart thing to do, to reset the running form, to manage the physical stress. And, you know, when a lot of people, you know, walking up Gun Road, which is, you know, best part of a mile at 10%, was a much better idea than trying to run up it. Luke Bell walked up at the first lap because he was using it to walk the cramps out of his legs, and he figured it would be a better option than running up it poorly. You know, last year's Ironman world champion was noticed to be walking through the aid stations, and you can pretty much guarantee that that was not because he couldn't help himself but walk, because he decided once he'd got ahead in the race that that was the best way of taking in his nutrition, managing the heat stress, and maybe resetting the form to clear the mind and get on with running the next piece of the race. So yeah, it's the walk break is not just for those people who are evolving in their run. It makes sense for everybody, and you know, it's this knowing what good form running is, knowing that you can consciously subtract elements of it, knowing that there is some variation in your run. There are some tools in the bag other than just gradually declining into a shuffle. It's really, really important. And yeah, you've got to go practice it in training, and you've got a constant awareness of right tool for the job, what's the current physical resource. You know, many of you, it won't be how fast you're running, won't be why the heart rate comes up. It will be an accumulation of stress and or heat that drives the heart rate up. But the same thing applies. Reset, lower the stress, and run with good form as often as possible and practical. And it gets you from A to B definitely quicker than deteriorating into a shuffle and staying that way for 20 kilometers.
I walk, I shuffled. It's super. Well, that's we've had people come on and then we've had people leave, but someone has been here the whole time, loyally listening even to our nonsense before we started recording. Nancy, any questions today?
No questions, I'm just listening.
All right, that means we are faced with the burden of either going to Boulder, Colorado. Oh no, he's not in Boulder, is he? Well, going somewhere to a Boulder, Colorado resident who's German, or to Aberdeen. And because you are muted, Dave, I'm going to go to Aberdeen.
Hi, Matt. I've got a question, but I guess I've just got one comment on MFP as well. I seem to be sort of getting MFP a lot better now. But one thing I noticed certainly when I was starting off a bit and really focusing on, you know, the foot drive and stuff, I really noticed my calves were getting pretty hammered. So I guess that's, yeah, probably a good thing to note. People are having the same issue. But yeah, I did an MFP run this morning though, and my calves seem a lot better from it. So
definitely, you know, when you're doing some of the hill running, some of the strength-based hill running, we had some of our more elite athletes, our pros in Hawaii, saying, "Wow, I feel it in my butt." And it's like, well, that's a good thing. You're actually using your butt, not just your quads, but also when you sort of do have this awareness of MFP. We have a very, very good amateur that is moving to pro, and her running was very knees forward, sort of marching band and leaning back. And over 2 weeks of camp, we got her moving towards this direction. But of course, then the awareness of pushing off, and she said to me, wow, my calves are really sore. That's a normal thing. And Paul might add something to it, but what I said to her is, be really aware, and it might be a thing that we have to do in her case, 2 days of running in a row, 1 day of not running at all, just to give your muscles, until it becomes trained up, that you can give sort of every 48 hours you have 24 hours of no running, just because the last thing you want to do is make this transition to better form and then have a calf injury, you know. So So it's good and it's normal, and it's using muscles that we want to use that you're not using before as you develop this awareness. But there is a real pragmatism. It's a really important, good point that you're making. By making that transition, it's a little bit like if you were to start doing push-ups, you wouldn't start with doing 20. That would be crazy. You would start with doing 2 by 5, and then you would progress to something like 2 by 35. Paul, anything to add on that?
No, it's a really good point, and I mean it's one of the reasons why we want to try and incorporate some off-road running on uneven surfaces, not necessarily groomed trails and so on, because that's really, really good at improving resilience and strength of the connective tissue in the ankle. The different foot placement and so on is really good for building up the calves and the smaller muscles in the leg because of that inconsistency with the way you put your feet on the ground. It's one of the things also, as someone said to me the other day, I can go to the stadium and practice my uphill running on the steps, you know, by doing the bounding on the steps. And I mean, it's a useful tool. You can go to it has no hills other than a car park, a bridge, and a stadium. And yes, you can practice the bounding on the steps, and you can accelerate until you feel it go, until you start stepping up with the quads and so on. But there's one element that you won't get on those steps is the slope of the ground, because each foot placement is on the flat. And as you run on progressively steeper hills, as I mentioned earlier, the foot placement gets where your foot strikes the ground, advances further and further forward on your foot, because you relative to the ground stay slightly leaned forward from vertical. And so as the slope goes up, you need to advance, you know, where your foot strikes the ground is going to be further forward on your foot, which creates a lot of tension in your calf. So, you know, doing that hill running is really, really important. And to some extent, a lot of people with the treadmill, with the springiness and the bounce of the treadmill when they're running uphill on the shallower gradients, still tend to land with a flat foot. So when you get to those steeper gradients on the treadmill, it's really, really good for that being aware that your contact patch with the foot changes as the gradient changes. So yeah, it's a good point. And I'm, you know, where you get to run on variable gradients a lot where you are, Duncan, so you know, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly.
In Aberdeen, even if you run on the roads, it's a little bit like running on trail. So although San Francisco is pretty similar to that. Super Dave.
The Boulder ride in Santa Clara. So I guess it applies to brick runs as well as runs. So we come off a long bike ride. Do you start with MFP because that's your best chance to get the form? Do you start with a walk to get the legs? Do you just try to survive the first mile? What's the take on that?
Well, you're coming off of this angle, yeah? You're coming off of time trial position. And so we need to get to this angle first. And so some of it depends on level of runner. In your case, Dave, I would actually start with getting to this, really importantly, and then getting it forward and making sure you're getting posterior drive. So I would actually have your first few 100 meters be power walking so that you can settle out of getting the heart rate, because T2 is generally a little bit of high heart rate spike, not as much as T1. The highest heart rate of the race will occur in T1. But T2, you're coming off the bike and you're basically resetting. So you might as well set up good form in a really patient way. And I would say globally, your first 2 miles or so of any race, the first mile of a half marathon, the first 600 meters in an Olympic distance, the first couple of miles of an Ironman, that's your only opportunity to set the tone for the rest of the race. You want to set the tone with great posture first. The thing that is always present is standing tall with good posture and getting the shoulders in front of the hips. That's what we always want, that to be present. And so whatever it is that helps you to get there, that you're most used to, that you can accelerate quickest to best form. But I would say for someone like you, Dave, that is probably starting with then transitioning to running, and now boom, you're settled, then extend for the amount of time that's appropriate with that. But again, you wouldn't do that if coming out of T2, the first 500 meters is 3% downhill. Then you wouldn't walk downhill. You've got to go to leg speed, and after that hill, then you settle down and you carry that leg speed. And once heart rate starts to creep, then you begin from there. So there is that caveat on the back end as well.
Okay, thank you.
And, yeah, Dave, it's for you with your run at this stage. It's setting up the elements of good form and a relatively conservative approach. But that doesn't mean when Matt says, the first couple of miles doesn't mean you're going to walk the whole way. At Taupo, what you're going to do is you're going to establish form. You're going to bring it up to a little bit of run. Do I own that run yet, or am I still settling off the bike? Ease back in, rinse and repeat until you get to a place where you've established that rhythm with your best form, and off you go. The better you get as a runner, the quicker that process, happens. It's like establish good form, build up to pace. Do I own it yet? Not quite. Settle back a little bit, rinse and repeat, and get to that place where you do own good form and you're managing the stress and using the right tools for the job. It's an important thing to do. If you go too conservative with the approach, what happens is you start using up pieces of the run course, and you've only got so much run course to use, but you want to establish good form, and then what you want to do is maintain best pace as often as you can. But what you don't want to do is practice running slowly for too long. Now, like I say, for you, that's a conservative approach. For someone like Duncan, it's build up to pace pretty quickly. Do I own this pace yet? No, I'm not quite ready to own it yet. And that might be rinse and repeat over a minute or 90 seconds or whatever until he owns the pace, and then he's off managing race pace plus or minus, or generally a little bit minus, or at race pace for the rest of the course. For you, it's a slightly longer process, but it's the same thing. It's trying the best protocol you can to build up to rhythm as soon as you can. It's going to take you a little bit longer, and you're going to spend a little bit more time on the using the alternatives to MFP, and then and trotting out your best running form as soon as you can, as often as you can. But it's just going to take you a little bit longer to get there.
Good stuff.
Okie dokie.
Good stuff. Any last questions before we pull the parachute cord? Go on then, Duncan.
I just, one more, just general one, really relating to like fueling of the sessions. I guess, well, probably in pre-season a while now, but things like, rush and sprint sessions, I sometimes find, I don't really know if I need it, but, as a reward, at least during the session, I maybe have like a shot block or something like that after one of the intervals. And I'm just wondering, I guess now we're moving into that more sort of pre-season and beyond. I guess fueling the session becomes more important. I've also noticed on some of my longer like trail runs, I'm not actually taking in any nutrition up to like 2 hours. So is that something I maybe need to start doing a bit more now?
The Russian sprints, if you got 3 rounds of Russian sprints, you theoretically get through with nothing, but you might want to just pad it with the way that you are. I think you're fine with that. But of course, on the back, and I would say Russian sprints globally, you want to have a clear gut. So you certainly can't do those an hour after a nice big lunch sort of thing. Or you don't want to have a 7 o'clock breakfast and 8 o'clock Russian sprint. I think it's very, very hard to be absorbing calories if you're doing them to the level that it seems like many are from the comments that I keep seeing in, I keep being called a certain presidents that we have named, but the longer runs, when you're doing those endurance runs outside and they're lower stress globally, there are other athletes that you can, if you're efficient, you can go through 2 hours with minimal to low calories. I think it's when you start to have really intense intentful is a word, pieces of work in there that you actually, and the personality change from go out and do an endurance run. You don't need too many calories. Again, you have to have fueling afterwards. But as you move towards racing, you want to get used to consuming some calories. And yes, you would want to, especially when the runs start to have variants of speed play and intervals in them, or blocks of work at race pace. You want to get used to consuming calories there. So I don't think there's anything wrong with what you're doing there right now. I would even say on the trail runs, by the way, when I can't stand coaches and say, this is how I did it. But when I was actually training for that trail marathon, if we went out for 2.5 hour run, I would be eating things like trail mix. I wouldn't have, and then I'd just have a gel or some blocks in my pocket that if I went to, if I needed a little pick me up with 45 minutes to go. But if I was eating, coconut macaroons and things like that. So there's nothing wrong with you taking your jammy Dodgers.
Excellent. I'll give that a go then.
Jammy Dodgers is okay, but avoid the Iron Brew. It's too much sugar.
Damn.
Yeah, Iron Brew could become trendy with a little bit of repackaging. Most people won't know what Iron Brew is, but
yeah, I think that would be a good energy drink.
It's the drink of hard men, lumberjacks, and things like that. So, all right, guys, good session there. So we'll look forward to some videos. Just a reminder: on Monday, I'm actually traveling. I have to launch out to go and kiss the ring at Ironman. So I'll be out there for 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, back for a Tuesday night. So so we will reshuffle the meetings of Matt. Our next session will be next Thursday, and that will be the day before Ironman New Zealand, because in the US Friday will be Dave, Ironman New Zealand. You get to race Laura, and you've got a chance against her because she's done an Ironman last week. So you might scalp her.
And you've told her to give me a 3-hour head start, right?
3.5 hours. I was trying to give you
3.5. She's doing a half. Awesome.
Yeah, trying to give you a shot.
I think I have a better shot racing Paul.
All right, guys. Thanks for coming today. Hope that was useful. Good stuff. Cheers. Take care.